Welcome back from lunch, everyone. I hope you all had a great time watching Brittany prepare delicious lunch, and that some of you actually followed along. But if not, I hope you can get some mushrooms and make that soon. It sounded really good. So I'm honored and privileged to moderate the next panel, which is the Media Advocacy panel. And as the name suggests, the panel is all about media. So we thought about representing the different types of media on this panel in this plant-based space, in this case, documentaries and food media outlets. Today, we're pleased and honored to introduce the following three speakers. So Elaine is an award-winning journalist with more than 20 years of experience covering topics such as nutrigenomics and even corporate espionage, which is really fascinating. I'm curious to hear more about that. Originally from England, a decade ago, Elaine came to the US to run Food Navigator USA, a leading online B2B title in the US food and beverage industry. Food Navigator USA provides insights on everything from investment, incubation and innovation, ingredients, food science, product information, labeling, litigation, regulation, consumer trends, new products, technology, basically anything you name it in this food space. So she's been observing what's going on in this space for the last few years. So we're curious to hear about her perspective on that. James is the producer and narrator of the Game Changers documentary, something that many of you have probably seen. It turns out Elaine just saw it last weekend. So I was newly excited about that. It's a critically acclaimed documentary account of the dramatic rise of plant-based eating in professional sports. James is a former Ultimate Fighter champion and serves as a combatives trainer for the US government. And Men's Health UK recently ranked James as #3 on their list of 13 most influential men in health and fitness, which is incredibly impressive and a wonderful boon for this sector. James, I remember meeting you actually at the Plant Stock event a couple of years ago and seeing the original documentary with the original ending before the final cut. So it was really cool to meet you there and see that original, the original cut and sort of how it's evolved. And I even remember talking to you a few years before that. So it's been amazing to see how it started and what's become of it. So we'd love to hear more about that background from you.
Definitely.
And then Joseph is as the producer and writer for the Game Changers, bringing a wealth of experience in the plant-based industry, including coordinating the report What's on Your Plate in Canada. And I mentioned I'm also a fellow Canadian, so excited to know that you're coming to us live from Canada, playing a pivotal role in the founding of nutritionfacts.org, something that a lot of you are probably familiar with, which is a leading resource on plant-based nutrition, which is viewed by millions every day. I know my mom checks it every time that something comes out on a Nutrition Facts. So we're very excited to have you here today convening with us. And before we begin, I'd love to give you each a chance to tell us a little bit more about your backgrounds. So feel free to give us like a 5-minute little intro on your background and what you work on today. So Elaine, maybe we'd start with you.
Yeah, so as you can probably tell from the British accent, I grew up in the UK, but I've lived in the US for about 10 years, so not quite as long as James, and I suck at martial arts, but I've been writing about the food industry on both sides of the Atlantic for quite a while. So today I edit a publication called Food Navigator USA, which is a trade publication, so I write about the industry for the industry. And I'd say over the last 3 years or so, the amount of coverage that we've given to plant-based has kind of risen, significantly. And that's not necessarily because it warrants that from a dollar sales perspective, because it totally doesn't. I mean, plant-based meat is like 1% of the market, but that's where so much of the innovation, and excitement and investment is. Everybody wants a piece of the action now, whether it's, all of the big meat companies are describing themselves as protein companies now. The dairy companies are all investing in plant-based. You've got the big CPG companies, wanting a bit of the action, all of these sexy startups. And then you've got these kind of pioneering brands that were talking about all of this stuff 40 years ago. And now everyone's paying attention because, Silicon Valley's, investing in the space. And, that must be, that's kind of interesting. And then, of course, there's the opportunists you get in every industry who are kind of slapping the words plant-based on chocolate brownies and potato chips, which I guess are technically plant-based, but not really necessarily contributing much to this, And I also write a lot about alternative based, so cell cultured meat and dairy, but also this kind of new wave of products produced by microbial fermentation that aren't necessarily from plants or animals. And I think that's going to present, an interesting kind of challenge for the industry and the media as to how you describe these, which, you can make food to order, it's more sustainable. How do you talk about food made in a fermentation tank in a way that's appealing to consumers? I would say, to me, what is interesting is that if you ask consumers in an iFix survey or something like that, do you want to eat more plant-based? Everyone says yes, they do. They want to eat more fruits and vegetables. They don't say, I want to eat more dairy-free ice cream made from tapioca, maltodextrin, and soybean oil and modified cornstarch. And there's nothing wrong with those things. They're all made from plants. But I think what we're seeing in the food industry at the moment is this kind of arms race to replicate the Western diet, just without animals, by creating these increasingly sophisticated kind of drop-in replacements for burgers and pepperoni pizza and ice cream and you name it. And, so I'm now writing about companies that are literally, employing astrophysicists and machine learning experts, synthetic biologists, computer scientists that are reverse engineering animal foods and then rebuilding them again, molecule by molecule. And I think it's exciting. But from a nutritional perspective, they're using a pretty limited toolbox. So you've got, extruded and soy protein, you've got coconut oil, starches, methylcellulose, all that kind of stuff. And again, nothing wrong with those ingredients. I'm not one of these kind of anti-processed food people, but it's just a fairly limited toolbox. And if you ask a dietitian, what does a healthy plant-based diet look like? They're talking about eating all the colors of the rainbow, getting whole grains and nuts and pulses and vegetables and so on. And, that's not really what you're getting from these kind of plant-based products. So, in my personal opinion, I'd also like to see, how can we actually make it easier? How can the packaged food industry make it easier for us to eat 30 plants a week, as I can't remember his name, Dr. Bulsiewicz, so I pronounced that right, as he was saying yesterday, how can we actually do that? And I think we're starting to see some innovation there as well in the frozen food section of the supermarkets, more kind of power bowls and sort of microwavable plant-based meals and stuff like that. So that's exciting. And you're seeing that the meal kit companies and the plant-based kind of prepared food delivery services get into that. But I see that as an exciting opportunity from a health perspective, as well as these kind of plant-based meat analogs. So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
That was wonderful, Elaine. Thank you so much. And certainly what you're saying about the sort of move toward health is incredibly important. And I think part of the health dimension is this performance and kind of like, how can we actually use diets to fuel better performance in athletics? That's something that obviously James and Joseph know a lot about. So maybe James, you can go next and tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into this space.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I spent 20 years of my life sort of researching the truth in combat, if you will. There's a lot of nonsense in martial arts. Most martial arts out there, really aren't very effective. And so I spent 20 years sort of doing what Bruce Lee would say, to research your own experience, absorb what is useful, reject what is useless, and add what is specifically your own. And, I became like one of the most elite trainers in self-defense and combatives for the US military and government agencies and so forth. And my focus was really on realistic self-defense, but I felt the need to test myself out for The Ultimate Fighter, which is a reality show for the UFC. I won that show and got a contract. And I got injured training for a fight. So for those people that haven't seen the film, I tore ligaments in both of my knees. And I thought, well, what can I do that's productive with my time? What would be the best use of my time? And so I thought, well, I haven't really looked into nutrition for optimal recovery and then for optimal performance. And so I started digging around in the scientific literature, the peer-reviewed literature, and first came across a study about the Roman gladiators. And it turns out that they were eating almost exclusively, if not exclusively, plant-based. And I thought, well, this can't be true, because you've got to have meat and eggs and dairy to build both strong muscles and strong bones. And that was sort of a turning point for me to really start digging in to the research heavily and start traveling around and interviewing these the experts in nutrition and talking to some of the athletes. And I was fortunate enough to meet Joseph, who's on the call with us today, who's got many years, 30 years in sort of has been plant-based for 30 years, doing the research for 30 years. and has also had writing skills. And so I was just very fortunate to meet Joseph, which is what got us on this track into the Game Changers. But what I sort of spent 20 years researching the truth in combat, I now sort of decided to shift my focus and look at the truth in nutrition and really dig down, push aside the BS and seeing what do we actually need. Let's push aside these myths and see what we actually need to fuel our bodies optimally. And I was sort of shocked at what I found. And that led to Joseph and I creating the Game Changers documentary. And I feel like I used to write self-defense, and I still do some of that. But now I feel like I've shifted my focus onto internal defense, which is really much more important. It's like how you're fueling your body to perform optimally and to live healthy, into your later years as well. So that's sort of been my journey.
I love the idea of internal defense. Yesterday, Dr. Katz also mentioned, one of the best things you can do to help, prevent yourself from getting something like COVID or any other disease is really like having a great diet. So I think that's an incredibly important component, and may or may not involve, eating some of these plant-based processed foods. So Joseph, you and James make a great pair. You're kind of like the person behind the camera who kind of thought about, how to conceive this message of this film. So can you tell us a little bit about your background prior to the Game Changers and what led you to that?
You're on mute, Joseph.
You're on mute, I think. There we go. Perfect.
Good writer, but not technically very.
Well, that was actually for comedy value, so I think it was. So yeah, I also in the men's health ranking. I came in 33,142nd. I'm as well. Pretty influential. So I actually started in my late teens investigating this stuff just as a student, and I thought it was pretty fascinating. And then later I went to school for it. I studied nutrition. I studied farming systems, specifically intensive livestock operations, which most people refer to as factory farming. I unfortunately also did thesis work in slaughterhouses. So I got to see sort of the beginning, middle, and end of the process for animals, and I studied it as emotionally removed as possible. It's difficult to do if you like animals, but I tried to do that. And as my research continued, I think I spent 7 years at a couple of different universities during that period. I also did study screenwriting, by the way, but in comedy specifically. So I'm not sure it translates into documentary work. But during that period, I realized that there was a lot more at stake here than just some of the stuff I was seeing in these facilities. So my scope of research expanded to include the environment, rural communities, and the impact that these factory farms have on them, public health. And then I did coordinate a 60,000 word report with 25 different Canadian professors, all highly respected in their field, on the impact of animal farming on those 4 different areas. So animal welfare, rural communities, environment, and public health. My wife, who co-wrote and co-produced the film, also has a master's in this space. She focused more on just and sustainable food systems, but specifically food literacy in children. So her interest was more on the impact side of things. Like, if we already have access to information, how do we get that to people? So between me and her and James, I think, and of course, Louis and Mark, our writer, Louis was our director, and our editors, we made a pretty good team. So it was a huge team effort, the film. And as James may or may not have mentioned, it took about 7 or 8 full years and a lot of money. We ended up with 600 hours of footage and pared it down to 85 minutes, which was really painful. One of the most painful things James and I have ever had to do, because some shoots would cost, $1,000, and those just didn't end up in the final cut at all. And we tried to keep a very high production value. We wanted the film to look as appealing as, people are used to in terms of like the media that they watch. When you look at a commercial that's built to capture your attention. We wanted to make sure that this just didn't look like a low budget documentary with sort of low level experts and low level athletes. So that's part of why it took so long and cost so much money, is James and I just continually kept pushing the envelope and realizing that we needed to go one more step. In fact, when we premiered at Sundance in 2018, we got standing ovations and I think every single show. But James and I didn't feel right about the final cut. We kind of knew going into it, it was a little rushed because we didn't think we'd get in, and then we got in. So we actually, despite all this attention and these offers from different distributors, we went back to the drawing board. We reopened the edit, spent another 6 or 7 months, and that's during the period that we filmed the Tennessee Titans, the American football team, Lewis Hamilton, and basically redid half the movie. It was really a painful process, because right when you think you're done and everyone's happy with you, but deep down you think this isn't good enough. And our focus for the whole process was on, like James said, the truth in nutrition. So I've been convinced for a couple of decades that people should eat more plant-based foods. I have the sort of academic background to believe that to be true. But I think that the process that we went through with the film was much, much more rigorous than anything I'd done before, because we realized that if we were going to reach, estimates are that we've reached between 50 and 100 million people have seen the film, that we just didn't want to fall into that trap of looking like we cherry-picked research or we were exaggerating, that our experts weren't really experts. So some people feel that we did that, I'm sure, people who are like into the paleo diet or the keto diet or the carnivore diet, which is the most extreme version. But the truth is, and I can talk about it more later, we discarded in very powerful studies and research that would have been even more sort of shock and awe sort of material in favor of the middle path, which is a mainly plant-based diet, mainly whole foods. And, you can't say a whole lot beyond that in terms of health. You could make ethical arguments, I suppose, or environmental arguments to go even further, like 100%, if that was your choice. But we really chose to not tell people what to do. We hope it came off that way anyway. So that was our goal in making the film, was to be honest and keep the film science-based, but also tell some pretty compelling stories, including James. James originally didn't want to be in the film. When I first met him, he just about the myths around protein. He wanted to kind of make it quick, so did I, which was, looking back, very naive. And then I said, well, I think you'd make a really good narrator. And he just really balked at the idea. It took quite a bit of convincing. So the way that the film changed over time was pretty dramatic, including having James as the star, which to be honest, I kind of feel sorry for him for, because before COVID, he could not go outside in LA once. He told me for months straight, it was every single day someone recognized him. And as fun as that probably is the first 5 times, I'm sure that it's gets a little tiring at a certain point. So I apologize for telling James that he should star in the film.
Thank you, Joseph. So I want to kind of circle back to the film and ask you more about, how you crafted the message, because I think that even just from anecdotal experience in my own life, like so many people have seen it, and especially men have been really impacted by it. And I think that that's one of the motivations you had, is really to sort of like target this myth around, meat and masculinity. But I wanted to start off a little bit more broadly about, the role of media in sort of promoting this space. So like this documentary has been incredibly important in changing the cultural narrative. But Elaine, as somebody who, has spent a lot of time in the last 20 years, seeing this industry from a broader perspective, and not just in the plant-based space, but really just seeing food more generally. Can you tell us a story of like how you actually witnessed this sudden shift in mainstream food culture from basically ignoring plant-based to suddenly talking all about it? And as you said, it's kind of disproportional because it's only like 1% of the food industry, and yet it has so much attention, and that's even just shown by the amount of people at this conference. So I'm just curious, as somebody who's covered this trend for a long time, like what do you think has kind of triggered that, and what is the role of things like documentaries like Forks Over Knives or the Game Changers more recently
Yeah, I've got to say, just say to James and Joseph, having watched this documentary 2 years after everyone else, I'm rather embarrassed that 50 million people saw it before I did, but I thought it was really cool because just on a practical level, I think, all the research says when it comes to, choosing these foods, that you can talk to people about the environment, you can talk about animal welfare. I mean, I became a vegetarian 30 years ago because I didn't like the idea of killing animals, right? But, that doesn't, sadly, persuade enough people to change their behaviour. If you appeal to their self-interest, which is their health, and that nearly always is the top reason why people pick some of these products and diets, I think that makes, absolute sense as a way in. And then obviously challenging some of these misconceptions is really important. But going back to kind of what triggered the shift, I was kind of thinking about this because you sent me this question in advance. And I don't think it was any one trigger. It's always a combination of things. And then once you hit a certain level of awareness of any trend, it then builds a momentum of its own, because then food companies sense a commercial opportunity and people see that, Burger King's selling a Whopper. And then, now we're hearing that McDonald's is going to be putting together a McPlant menu and so on. So after a bit, it becomes kind of self-sustaining.
We need some help with branding, though. McPlant, I wasn't super.
I'm not sure. I don't know if that's a working title. I hope so. But I mean, I kind of divide it into like 4 things. I think one is like a shift in terminology and consumer messaging away from being something that you are, like a vegan or a vegetarian, to something more of a food trend, plant forward, plant-based. You don't have to be plant-based. Well, some people are, but it's not really necessarily a lifestyle choice. You can just see it as a food trend. It's just something you can dip into, and it's something that food companies can get behind. It's a lifestyle for some people, but it's not something you have to be 100% of the time, like perhaps being a vegan or a vegetarian. And I think, the consumer research shows this as well. Vegan and plant-based might sound like they're interchangeable, but that's not how consumers view those terms. And the research bears all that out. Maxim's done some pretty cool research on that a couple of years ago. Vegan products, I think, historically are for vegans, and there aren't that many of them. Plant-based products are for anyone and everyone. And I think that just nomenclature shift has kind of changed the conversation and the addressable market as well, just in a practical sense. I mean, the other thing I think is technology. I mean, the obvious fact is that on a more practical level, the latest generation of plant-based products is just exponentially better. And, like I said, you've got astrophysicists working on this stuff now. And I think once you get to a certain level of mimicry, the question then is not, why would you have an Impossible Burger, but why wouldn't you if everything else is equal, and particularly on price, and we're not there yet. But that's kind of the argument these companies are making. It makes sense. And I think also, I mean, the founders of this like new wave, next generation companies, from the very start, they've been very clear that their addressable market is meat. They're going after meat eaters. And that's just, a different mindset, I think, than some of the first generation of these companies. I think the third thing I would say is just novelty and choice. And this is like my key kind of point, is that I think we can get kind of carried away about how people care about the environment and and animals, and of course they do, and there's been that clear change in the last few years. But most people, I think, buy products in this space because the products have got better, and as a result, more people are buying them, and they're providing novelty and choice, in the food market. So if you go to a coffee shop and they've got milk, dairy milk, and they've also got oat milk, some people think, yeah, I'll just give oat milk. Right? They're not saving the planet or worrying about animals. They're just thinking, oat milk sounds pretty cool. I'll see what it's like in my coffee. And it tastes pretty good. And they're like, I might buy that again. So, I think sometimes we can get a bit carried away with some of the purchase drivers. And it's sometimes just as simple as that. I mean, why did hummus become a multi-million-dollar market? It wasn't because people were thinking about it as part of the plant-based foods movement. It's because it tastes pretty cool. And by the way, I guess you could position it as a plant-based product, but that's not necessarily why, it became, I don't know how big that market is now, but it went from kind of virtually nothing to, hundreds of millions. And I think, again, if you look at each market separately, like fluid milk, if you say, fluid milk sales are in terminal decline because, consumers are worried about greenhouse emissions and sustainability. If that was really true, why are sales of dairy cheese still going up? Why are people buying lactose-free dairy milk? Why are people buying high-protein dairy milk? You know, so it's not as simple as saying, you know, people are caring about the environment and they're moving away from dairy, because, you know, each market is different. People buy products that they like, and if they can feel good about them, so much the better. But, you know, build it and they will come, you know. So that's just kind of and then the final thing I would say is that when it comes to like the media conversation, I think that it's a question of reframing the debate. So an example, like I've been writing about egg replacers, sadly, for 20 years, you know. And I remember when Handsome Creek, now called Eat Just, came along a few years ago. And I was thinking, like, why are they getting so much media coverage, right? What's so special about their egg replacers, right? And I think what was different was less about the product, although, you know, it was quite a good product, but was, you know, their chief executive wasn't talking about egg replacers. He was talking about fixing the broken food system, and he was getting like TV interviews, and he was talking to CNBC, and it wasn't just people like me that were writing about him, you know, anymore. It was like the mainstream media. And, you know, he's taking like out 4-page adverts in the New York Times. And I think a tiny startup was getting a totally disproportionate amount of PR, you know, for a company making a niche product, vegan mayonnaise, right? And what had been a kind of dull technical challenge for the food industry is suddenly sexy and important, you know. And I think you now see that with some of these brands like Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods and Memphis Meats in the cell-based space. You know, they're getting this kind of media coverage that these first wave companies 40 years ago could never hope for. People are excited about them. And I think, you know, COVID-19 has also kind of shone a bit of a light in the mainstream media about factory farming and so on. But, and just finally, I think, you know, these kind of brands, you know, they're selling brands, they're selling aspirational brands. They're not selling, you know, they're not selling veggie burgers, like you said, they're selling something more aspirational, and that's how you get, you know, young people engaged as well. And again, documentaries like, you know, The Game Changers, you know, people want to change the world, and the conversation has just been kind of reframed, you know, from a kind of narrow food industry conversation to something a bit bigger. So.
Yeah, thank you so much, Elaine. I think those are such great points. And there are definitely things that I noticed as well doing my dissertation at Harvard and now working on my book. And as you said, one of the main things has been reframing the conversation. So it's not so much, of course, the products are different, the products are better, but there's also been a cultural reframing. And as you said, a key part of that has been making it aspirational. And people like James are, you know, you embody now, you know, what people think of as a vegan or someone who's plant-based. And that's definitely not the case even 5-10 years ago. And I think that, you know, now we see, you know, men who are interested in, you know, being muscular and, you know, being strong, like going to the grocery store and buying more of these plants. And I think that, you know, the media has been incredibly important in sort of framing that. And so part of, you know, Hampton Creek's success is also partly because Josh Testrick, you know, embodies is sort of a different way of what like a CEO of a plant-based company looks like. And I think that's also part of it. So going back to that, like, I was wondering if James and Joseph, you could talk about, you know, how you tried to use the film to kind of target that image of like what is plant-based and what is like an athlete and actually what fuels an athlete. So, you know, how did you kind of frame and shape the message so that it really could have that impact? Because I've noticed like of my male friends who've seen the film, that's really the only film that's really had an impact in that way, because it really targets that last bastion, I feel, of misconceptions around this diet and this lifestyle. So if you could both speak to that, I would love to hear about that.
Yeah, Joseph, you want to take that? You're on mute again. Yet again.
Sorry about that. Yeah, just as the one of the writers, and like the, you know, main people deciding with James on who was, you know, who we were going to interview, which athletes we were going to speak to. I have to say that the film basically followed James's journey, so which coincided very nicely with the impact that we were hoping to have once the film was fully edited. James legitimately started off by moving into a paleo diet, and he was eating more grass-fed beef and free-range chicken, and you know, like that sort of standard move that men make. In reality, over the last 30 years, until the last couple, not a lot has changed in the space There have always been fad diets come and go, including the, Diet for a Small Planet, Fit for Life, Diet for America, these different books that pique people's interest in eating plant-based. But the mainstay of diets has always been a meat-based one, whether it's South Beach, Atkins, the paleo diet, keto diet. And there's a reason for that. And that's because at the very center of our understanding of what food is, the majority of people think that their muscles come from eating muscle. Their bones, in other words, meat, their bones are made from cow's milk. Their brains are made from fish and eggs. And then the rest is more or less just like some vitamins and minerals and maybe some fiber that we get from plants. Plants are like a side dish, and they're not the foundational elements of what make a human, physically a human, which is interesting because you have rhinos and elephants and, hippos and horses and gorillas and the biggest land animals on the planet eat only plants. Their muscles and bones and brains seem to work just fine without eating meat. But we've become convinced that it's a part of our evolution. It's a part of our sort of the way we're trained to eat nutritionally, that meat and dairy and eggs are sort of at the core of the diet element. So what James ran into as we were making the film was that this is not only not true, but a bold-faced lie that has taken billions of dollars to sustain. And the only reason we're sitting here having this conversation is because of those billions of dollars. The reality is so suppressed about the power of a plant-based diet to prevent and in some cases even halt chronic degenerative disease. It's so overwhelmingly obvious when it comes to the environment. The animal thing is like beyond obvious. If you like animals and you watch slaughterhouse footage, you're just like, who wants to do that? And the other impacts, even economically, a plant-based diet, if you have time, is much more affordable. So Malcolm Gladwell or people that thought leaders in the space of like what makes something sticky would say this is a very sticky idea. And yet we've been at it for 30 or 40 years and very little progress was made. In fact, I think 2017, when meat prices dropped, meat consumption went up by 5% that year in the US. So we're live under this illusion that we're on this trend, like more and more and more and more and more vegans, or whatever you call them. But it really hasn't been happening until a little bit more recently. And that's in part why our focus and James's focus was on the mythology around it and the core mythology, which just happened to sync up with James's core beliefs also, which was that you need strength to be strong, you need it for testosterone, you need it to be a man, you need it to be a true athlete, you need these core principles were, they just came up naturally. I mean, and we addressed them as they were. So even though, of course, in editing and with writing, you sort of craft, well, whose story are we going to tell first? Patrick's, Scott's, Bryant's, the Titans, like how is this going to flow? Even like naturally, James's heart attack, that literally it wasn't something that happened like 16 years ago and then we stuck it in the film and made it look like it happened while we were making the film. So that was a natural pivot point for us at the time from performance over to health. So in terms of the question being, how did we craft the film to sort of address things? I mean, obviously when you edit stuff, you try to make it as appealing as possible. You try to make transitions natural and that sort of stuff. But this was James's authentic journey, and a lot was left on the cutting room floor that would make it seem even more authentic, to be honest. But we had to keep things moving. So
Joseph, just a note, I don't see your video anymore. Do you guys see his video? I think. Oh.
The audio got funny for a second there, but I can still see it.
Joseph, if you could just refresh your browser, that might solve things for some people in case they don't see your video. But James, I kind of want to ask you the same question, but I remember like talking to you a few years ago when you were still working on the film, where you basically said like that you were actually looking into research on like behavioral economics and the sort of like how do you shift people's perceptions of things, and like sort of how did you actually, like in terms of like approaching, how do you craft it in terms of convincing people? Because as Joseph rightly said, like, there are lots of more people who are eating plant-based, but there's lots of people who are still eating meat. So they're kind of like rising at the same time, those trends. So I'm kind of curious how you approach, like, how do you actually shape it? So it was your journey, but then how did you manage, like, because also I think you did a really good job of like having, you know, this misconception, and here we're going to like address it. And here's this misconception, and here we're going to address it, you know? So I guess if you could tell us more about how you approached it.
Yeah, I mean, like Joseph said, it was my authentic journey. It just sort of so happened that the behavioral psychology research that we looked into sort of really tied in with the way I felt about things. So for example, to be tough and to like have testosterone and to be a real man, you know, I really felt that we, particularly for me, I thought that I really had to eat a lot of meat, being a UFC fighter and a sort of tough guy, if you will. Not that I am particularly tough, but you know, that was sort of the perception I had, that you really had to do that. And it sort of tied in with the behavioral psychology. You know, 8 out of 10 plant-based eaters previously were female. That's really shifted a lot since the Game Changers came out.
Yeah.
But it just so happened that the behavioral psychology sort of tied in. For example, when I met Damien Mander, you know, who had 10 tours of duty in Iraq, has seek and destroy tattooed across his chest.
His story is amazing. If people don't know about his story, you have to look him up, and like the, you know, the women that he works with as well. It's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, and with you know, 6'4", 240 or 250, and just like a powerhouse, you know. And when I met him, it just felt like it really resonated with me, because I really had this perception that if you were sort of vegan or vegetarian, you were a long-haired hippie, tree-hugging, live in a commune, or something like that. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Yeah, from Berkeley, yeah. And not that there's anything wrong with that, it just didn't really resonate well with me. And so when I met someone like Damien, I realized, you know, I'd seen the science, but it was meeting people. And I think the behavioral psychology ties in with that, and the film sort of helps with that as well. Is it's really like showcasing role models that people can, you know, relate to or look up to. I mean, we're not trying to say what a real man is as filmmakers, but, you know, having athletes, firefighters, and soldiers in the film, I think really helps people when you tie that in with the actual powerful science. I think that becomes very helpful in getting the message across.
Right. Well, I just want to turn to some questions from the audience, since we have about 10 minutes left. One question from Eric to James and Joseph is, I meet people who get super excited about eating plant-based and vegan after watching the film, but then some crash and revert back to eating animal products. What do you have found to be successful in helping people to incorporate and sustain the actual important lessons that they've learned in the film?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is getting inspired by the film, right? And another thing is then, well, what do you do about it? So the film is sort of the why, and then following that, we get messages from, I mean, we've had hundreds of very elite athletes contact us since the film came out, including, Olympic gold medalists, many of them, people from the UFC, NBA, NHL, just asking, hey, how do I switch? And thousands or tens of thousands of people emailing or messaging us through social, asking, how do I make the switch? I mean, I think there's lots of resources out there, but it's one of the reasons that we put together on the website lots of tips on, how much protein do you really need, and recipes, obviously. But I think there's many ways. One of the things that we say is it's not all or nothing, it's all or something. So some people sort of have this idea that, well, if I'm going to do it, I've got to be all in and commit forever, which is not the case at all. And in most cases, that's actually not the best way to go about it. Because if you try and switch overnight, you don't have family or community support. You don't know what recipes you're going to eat. You're suddenly increasing your fiber, which could give you sort of intestinal issues if you're suddenly changing your diet. So we like to, for most people, it's better to shift over time. One of the things you can do is find easy substitutes, right, for meat or for dairy, and there's lots of options as we talked about now. So there's ways to sort of plantize or veganize your current foods that you eat. And then there's already things that people are eating, right? So if someone eats a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and they eat that once every couple of weeks, maybe eat that once every week. So you can increase the things that you're eating that are already plant-based. And then also discovering new recipes. Again, there's tons all over the internet. There's some on our website, Game Changers Movie. And you'll just figure out what you like. And you'll find that those things taste great. They help you, make you feel good. And that'll sort of end up crowding out some of those animal foods. And like I said, it doesn't have to be all in. You don't have to commit forever. The research really does show that any sort of shift towards eating more plant foods, especially whole plant foods, is going to be beneficial for your health and also for your performance. And so I think that's one of the main things is not making people feel like they've got to be 100%. I mean, a lot of people end up getting that anyway because we've removed these really long-standing myths, and people sort of know that eating plant-based is better for them. There's so much research, as Joseph said, about the environment and about animals. But I think people really want to shift in that direction anyway. And I think what we've done with the film is remove those barriers. But for us, for most people, it's sort of gradually getting into it and not trying to go 100%, overnight.
Absolutely. That's really our philosophy of Plant Features as well, is try to get, kind of open up the opportunity for lots of people to come in, even if they're not, 100% plant-based. And so I have another question from the audience for Elaine. And then I have a personal question about the film that I actually wanted to ask as well. So Elaine, the question is, it was about your comments about consumer choice. So the person said, to further the momentum of this shift, do you think it's important to continue leaning more and more into novelty and consumer choice, or do you think that we need to try and bring in the argument and framing of environmentalism and human and animal rights? Like, what kind of needs to shift in the media? Kind of similar to what James was just saying about the other arguments that people might be bringing into this lifestyle.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's one or the other, because, like, for example, I became a vegetarian when I was 10 because I grew up in a town called Shrewsbury in the UK, and I saw this anti-vivisection society poster with a cow, and the slogan.
Very active in England, the whole history of vegetarian and vegan groups.
Yeah, and the slogan was "meat means murder," and I remember I had this horrific poster on my wall in my bedroom at home with a cow with its guts hanging out of it, and that doesn't persuade most people to change their diets, and so I think you've got to do both. I think that and people and consumers will come in from different angles. So I think many of these companies are mission driven, and they want to improve. They've got a sustainability message or animal welfare message, but that's not necessarily the primary purchase driver for most consumers. My husband is a meat eater. He had his first Beyond Burger. We were on vacation because he saw it on a menu. He'd heard of the brand. It seemed pretty cool. It was in the main burger section, and he tried it and thought it was pretty good. It was as simple as that, And
that later on today.
My mum, for example, she bought a nut roast at Christmas. She's still in the UK because she saw it on special offer in the supermarket and thought, oh, that's pretty cool. And she tried it. Again, she's not really thinking, I don't think, about whether she's a flexitarian or changing anything. It was a good product, and she'll probably buy it again. And I imagine that will probably displace meat at maybe, one meal every month or something. But so I think you've got to do both. And nobody likes being lectured to. I think it appeals to maybe a very small percentage of consumers that for whom it's a real lifestyle. But for most people, finger wagging and talking about the environment and animal welfare, I think that's important, but it's not the primary purchase driver. So we've got to focus, I think, on having more. And also, most people don't follow vegan chefs and things like that. I saw a question yesterday, it's like, who's your favorite vegan chef? And I'm really afraid to say I couldn't really answer that question because I'm not a foodie, even though I write about the food industry. Most people aren't. Whereas if I go to the supermarket and there's a microwavable plant-based meal and it's affordable and it looks pretty cool, I might try it. So I think we've got to, build those products and, let people just discover those things, as well as, encouraging, a more healthy lifestyle and all the rest of it.
Right. I'm just wondering as well, let's see, we have a few more audience questions. Okay. So one question is, in changing culture and perception, what is the role of immigrants and ethnic heritage foods in the plant-based media audience? So given that this event is mostly a conference that's included a lot of, speakers who are mostly white, how do you extend the choir and the voices in this space? That's a question I would love any of you to answer, really, if you would like to. Or something that maybe you considered when you were making the film, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the... Oh, go ahead, Joseph.
No.
I was going to say, if you look at the film, I mean, over 50% of the athletes and experts in our film were people of color. And Joseph could probably touch on a little bit about, how people of color are actually driving this movement and a significantly greater percentage than white people, typically you might think of sort of a whole food, people shopping at Whole Foods and white and affluent, but there's really a big shift in especially the Black community, and perhaps Joseph could touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, we're very cognizant of the fact that we're two white privileged males making a documentary about a way of eating that around most of the world is actually already in place, meaning plant-based. Most of the world get most of their calories and most of their actual protein from plants in the first place. And there's a strong heritage in almost every culture of eating predominantly plants. That doesn't mean that there aren't cultures that eat predominantly animal foods. There are, especially if they're in circumpolar or marginalized parts of the planet. The meat consumption goes up. But we think that that role is absolutely fundamental, and part of our role in filming in what we're doing in talk about yet, those people voices a seat at the table alongside us, and in many cases a louder voice than we have, because like James mentioned, the fastest growing demographic in the US of plant-based eating is happening in the Black community. And this has actually been happening for quite a while and just been widely ignored by the white sort of vegan advocacy community. And I'm sure that they'll try to co-opt that. In our case, we're trying to listen more carefully to what those people from diverse backgrounds are saying about this way of eating or eating more plant-based, and then support them in those efforts and let them lead us rather than the other way around. So we made the film to address some key issues, but as we did so, we did sort of look back and realize that our film was quite diverse, and all of our work moving forward will be even more diverse. We think that it's critical.
That's great to hear. Yeah, I think that especially in the athletic community, I think it's great that the film did feature more people of color and minorities, because they've been incredible icons in these spaces. So I thought that was a great thing that you did in the film, and I'm glad to hear that it's more kind of on your mind in your next project. So we do have a stretch break coming up, but just because we have more questions, I actually just wanted to ask about, if you could give us an update about what your next project might be, or even just if you can't speak about that, kind of like any unexpected outcomes. I know that, James, you worked with the military, but I know that potentially there's been some interest from the military around this, or like any, unexpected, amazing, exciting things that have happened as a consequence of the film. I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, I mean, as an organization, the military was probably the most interested out of any, because they're not really bothered about, these myths and the way that they look. They're interested in having the best optimal diet for their soldiers, right? For what they call warfighter effectiveness. They also spend millions and millions of dollars on healthcare unnecessarily, of things that could be prevented or even reversed with diet. And also retraining a soldier can cost millions of dollars when they can't even meet their physical requirements, and they have to hire another person for that. But the film was actually the first documentary ever to be accredited, and still is the only one to be accredited by the Department of Defense, the Defense Health Agency. And then the film went on to be accredited by the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, and through them, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, which basically means that every healthcare professional, doctor, nurse, dietitian, pharmacist in the United States can watch the film and take a quiz that we developed with the American College of Lifestyle Medicine to get continued medical education credit. So that was great.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was
given the fact that most people don't even get they barely get 2 hours of nutrition, that might be your film, those 2 hours. Just
that would probably be better than the 2 hours that they're currently getting. And of course, that's not enough, and we're working on ways to sort of help that. And there's other organizations out there as well, like the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, obviously, which is promoting plant-based eating now, and then the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. But in terms of the sort of the impact that the film had, there was 1.5 billion media impressions, including 40,000 organic press articles written about the film. In China, for example, we don't have the exact numbers of people that viewed it, but there was a single film review that had 1 million comments and 2 million likes, which sort of indicates how popular it was there. And according to Google Trends, interest in plant-based eating more than tripled within a week of the film hitting Netflix. So it was really shocking to see that the impact that the film really had. And I think that just the timing is right. And, now is the time that people are recognizing, for so many reasons, people are seeing what happens in factory farms. People understand the issues with the environment. So many issues with the environment that can be shifted. And it's really the number one thing that people can do, right, individually, is just to shift to a more plant-based diet. In terms of the environment, it's the number one cause of deforestation of the Amazon. It's the number one cause of hypoxic dead zones in the ocean. It's the number one thing that you can do in terms of preventing and halting major chronic diseases, heart disease. It's just like a no-brainer, right? It's a win-win-win. And I think people are recognizing that. I think we were fortunate the film came out sort of a right time when people are really ready to hear this message.
Absolutely. I think it really did come.
Yeah, and I just
please, Joseph, go ahead.
Jump in and add, just because I just wanted to address your questions really directly. You asked sort of if we could talk about what's coming up. We can't specifically because actually it's going to be launched in the next couple of weeks, like with a press release and all that sort of stuff. But basically, we've helped bring together some of the most influential and respected people in the field under a single umbrella. So people like some of the stuff that James is talking about, the military or the ACLM or these major institutions, people, department heads and so on. You mightn't be aware watching the film that this wasn't just two people that made a film and got some experts in it, but that in fact the response was overwhelmingly positive from the scientific community and some of these major health, performance, environmental, and other institutions. So we thought, well, we should put that on display and then also use the support that we've got to build out further campaigns and further projects. So look for something along those lines, basically, something that shows just how much support the film is, and the other films definitely paved the way in some aspects, but I think that it's important for us in building out this thing that's coming to sort of differentiate the difference. Sorry, that's a differentiate the difference, but what we other folks in the space are trying to do. Our focus is very science-based, and we're just not that interested in whether the rest of the vegan community is super happy about what we do or say or don't. Like all or something is not super popular in the vegan world. I'm sure they prefer to go all in. And that's fine. People do that. Some people make it through, but 5 out of 6 don't. And there's a reason for that. And we need to address the reasons why, and also address that it's not imperative that people do that anyway. It's not my business what you eat, really, to be honest. So we think the arguments are compelling enough. The science is compelling enough. The examples are compelling enough that if we could just keep getting it out there, and that's what this larger umbrella sort of organization or group that we're putting together will do, we think that will help tremendously. Make it more than just a film, because you do get pigeonholed as just one of like these 5 films. There are these 5 vegan films you can watch, and one of them is The Game Changers. And like, while we're flattered in some ways, I suppose, to be in a list of great vegan films or whatever, we'd just as soon rather not be in a list of vegan films, to be honest, because our film, was a little bit different in our approach and the science and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I certainly see that. And I don't know if vegans being mad is really a problem, because the vegans are only 3% of the population. So, most of the people are going to like the film probably. And I say that as a fellow vegan. So I think you've done an amazing job, and I'm excited to hear that it's having impact in China, because that's obviously a place where the growth of animal products is growing astronomically. And so this can have impact beyond the US. I think that would be incredibly wonderful. And you've all honestly been incredibly eloquent. Elaine, we loved hearing about your perspective on this industry. And James and Joseph, your film has been incredibly impactful on this space. Just saying that from a personal perspective, it's definitely the film I show everyone who's interested in this topic. And so thank you all so much for coming. And we went a little bit long just because there were so many interesting questions. And so we will have a networking session that will start in about 5 minutes.